I came home after a 12-hour shift, completely drained, already thinking about a hot shower and sleep. But when I pulled into the parking lot, my car was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. Heart dropped. Panic hit instantly. Then I noticed the bright orange notice taped to the curb. Towed. Not because I parked illegally. Not because I missed a payment. No, my car had been towed on the direct order of Sandra Kellner, the president of the Maplewood Commons HOA, because she decided my parking spot was better suited for her daughter, who had just moved into the complex. Apparently, the spot I'd been assigned for 3 years was suddenly more convenient for her family than for me. My car was sitting 9 miles away in an impound lot. Getting it back cost me $340. So I paid the fee, picked up my car, and drove home. I didn't argue with the tow company. I didn't call the HOA office screaming. I didn't pound on Sandra's front door. I just sat quietly at my kitchen table for about an hour, staring at the receipt in my hand. And then, I made one phone call. A very calm, very professional phone call that Sandra Kellner still talks about to this day, just not in the way she expected. Stay right here. Welcome to Proven Right Stories. If you're new here, subscribe. Get comfortable, because this one is absolutely worth your time. Let's get into it. My name is David Marsh. I'm 56 years old. And before I tell you what happened with Sandra Kellner, the HOA, and that parking lot at Maplewood Commons, there's something you need to understand about the way I was raised, because it matters to this story. My father used to tell me, "David, don't fight loud. Fight permanent." The first time he said that, I was 12 years old. Some kid at school had been stealing my lunch money for 3 days straight. I remember expecting my father to say, "Go hit him," or "Stand up for yourself." But he didn't. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Find the thing he actually needs from you, and then take it away. Quietly. Completely. Permanently." I've used that advice more times in my adult life than I can count. But this story, this was the most satisfying use of it by far. I'm a commercial real estate investor, not the flashy kind. I don't own skyscrapers in Manhattan. I don't post motivational quotes beside rented Lamborghinis. And I definitely don't have a fleet of Range Rovers. What I own are what I call boring assets. Strip malls, storage facilities, parking garages, small industrial buildings in secondary markets across the Midwest. Nothing glamorous, just steady cash flow and long-term value. Back in the spring of 2021, I moved into Maplewood Commons after selling a property in Indianapolis. I needed somewhere temporary to stay while I evaluated my next acquisition. The plan was simple: stay 6 months, then move on. I ended up staying 14, because Sandra Kellner gave me a reason to. Maplewood Commons was a mid-sized residential complex just outside Columbus, Ohio. Around 80 units. On the surface, it looked great. Clean sidewalks, fresh landscaping, quiet neighbors. The kind of place that photographs well for brochures. The HOA was run by Sandra Kellner, a 61-year-old woman who had held the position for 9 years, and carried herself with the exact confidence of someone who mistakes minor authority for actual power. She drove a white Lexus. She wore her HOA lanyard everywhere. And I mean everywhere. I once saw her wearing it at a grocery store. Sandra moved around the complex like she was inspecting property she personally owned, not managing a community, ruling one. I noticed her during my very first week there, not because she welcomed me, because she taped a violation notice to my front door. Apparently, my welcome mat extended 6 inches beyond the approved threshold dimensions and needed to be corrected within 48 hours. So I moved the mat, and then I opened my phone and made a note of the date and time. That was violation notice number 1. There would be 8 more after that. The citations covered everything. A wind chime on my balcony that was supposedly 2 inches too long according to balcony decoration guidelines. A guest who parked in visitor parking 15 minutes past the 2-hour limit. Even the color of my trash bin. The original one had cracked, so I replaced it with another gray bin that was maybe half a shade darker. Sandra declared it inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. And then there was my truck. A 2019 Ford F-150. Sandra cited it 3 separate times because she claimed it violated the spirit of the reserved parking program. Why? Because the truck occasionally extended 2 or 3 inches over the painted parking line. 2 to 3 inches. Yes, I actually measured it. And to be fair, she technically wasn't wrong. But in 9 years as HOA president, Sandra Kellner had somehow never cited anyone else for crossing a parking line that I made a note of that in my phone too. Her daughter's name was Brittany. She moved into Unit 47 in late October of 2021, and within 72 hours of arriving, she somehow had a reserved parking spot, Spot 12, the most convenient spot in the entire lot, just a few steps from the main entrance. That spot had belonged to a man named Carl. Carl had lived there for 6 years. Suddenly, he was reassigned to Spot 31, all the way at the far end of the lot, near the dumpster. Carl never complained publicly, but one evening, while we were checking our mail, he mentioned it to me in passing. He tried to sound casual about it, but his face said everything his words didn't. About 2 weeks after Brittany moved in, I came back from a property inspection in Dayton. I'd been on the road since 6 that morning. Long day, cold weather, completely exhausted. When I left that morning, my parking spot, Spot 7, was empty. But when I got home around 7:15 that evening, my truck was gone. I just stood there in the November cold for a few seconds, staring at the empty space like my brain hadn't fully processed it yet. Then I noticed Brittany's car parked there. A white Infiniti Q50, small dent on the rear bumper, fresh parking permit hanging from the mirror, one that definitely hadn't existed 2 days earlier. That's when I called the towing company listed on the sign near the entrance. They had my truck. Sandra had ordered the tow at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The reason listed on the paperwork was almost impressive in its arrogance. Unauthorized extended occupation of reserved space, temporarily reassigned per HOA authority. Temporarily reassigned. Like she was reallocating airport gates instead of stealing somebody's parking spot. I drove 9 miles to the impound lot, paid $340, signed the release paperwork, and drove home without saying a word to anybody. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about something my father used to say: don't fight loud, fight permanent. So I asked myself one question: what did Sandra Kellner actually need from me? As it turned out, the answer was $42 a month. Here's what Sandra never realized. The parking lot at Maplewood Commons wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't even owned by the apartment complex. It belonged to a tiny LLC called Northgate Property Holdings, a name so forgettable nobody there had probably ever paid attention to it. But I had. Not because of Sandra. I'd looked it up 6 weeks after moving in simply out of habit. Whenever I spend meaningful time around a property, I check ownership records. Occupational reflex. Northgate Property Holdings owned exactly one thing: the 1.4-acre parcel that made up the parking lot and the narrow service lane beside Maplewood Commons. The owner of record was a 73-year-old man named Earl Gibbons. Earl had inherited the parcel from his father and had been leasing it to the complex since 1987. The agreement was simple: $42 per parking space per month, 62 spaces total, which meant Earl collected around $2,600 a month from a parking lot he'd owned for over 3 decades and barely thought about anymore. The morning after my truck was towed, I called him. I introduced myself, explained that I worked in commercial real estate, and asked if he'd ever considered selling the property. There was a pause on the line. Then Earl chuckled softly and said, "My wife's been telling me to simplify my life for 3 years. What exactly are you thinking?" We met for lunch the following Thursday at a diner outside Columbus. Earl was exactly the kind of man I expected him to be: straightforward, practical, no games. The kind of person who makes decisions quickly because he spent 73 years learning that complicated people usually create unnecessary problems. We talked numbers for about 40 minutes. From a commercial real estate perspective, the parcel wasn't especially valuable. Just 1.4 acres in a suburban secondary market with no real development upside. A plain surface parking lot. But to me, it was perfect. We settled on a number Earl considered generous, and I considered the best $187,000 I had ever spent. We closed the deal 12 days after my truck got towed, and I didn't tell a single person at Maplewood Commons. The first thing I did after taking ownership was call my attorney and have him draft a brand new parking agreement. Earl kept collecting checks. The complex kept paying them. Nobody bothered reviewing the terms. So we rewrote everything. The new agreement raised the parking fee from $42 per space to $95 per month. Still reasonable for the Columbus market, but enough to get management's attention. And then I added one very specific clause: parking assignments, towing authorizations, and any changes involving reserved spaces would now require written approval from the lot owner. Not the HOA. Not Sandra Kellner. The lot owner. The updated agreement was delivered to the management office during the first week of January. I'll never forget the look on Sandra Kellner's face when she found out who owned the parking lot. She came to my door on a Thursday evening holding the agreement papers in her hand so tightly they were bent at the corners. And she had this expression people get when reality suddenly refuses to cooperate with the story they've been telling themselves. She looked at me and said, "The management office told me you bought the parking lot." I nodded. "That's right." She blinked a couple times. Then she asked, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because I invest in parking assets. That's what I do." She stood there silently for a moment, trying to process it. Then she asked the real question. "What does this mean for my position as HOA president?" I smiled politely. "Your position hasn't changed at all. You still handle landscaping, common areas, building rules, all of that." Then I looked past her toward the parking lot outside. "But the parking lot is mine, which means the parking decisions are mine now." She looked at me carefully and said, "Including the reserved spaces?" I nodded. "Including the reserved spaces." There was a long silence after that. The kind where somebody is trying very hard to stay composed while realizing the ground underneath them has shifted. Then Sandra said, "Brittany already has a reserved space." I leaned against the doorframe and replied calmly, "Brittany has a parking permit that was issued under an arrangement that no longer has any authority. She's welcome to apply for a space under the new agreement. The monthly rate is $95. Sandra stared at me for a second longer. Then she said the thing she'd clearly been thinking the entire time. "You did all this because your car got towed." I shook my head slightly. "No, I did this because it was a good acquisition. The towing situation was just an inconvenience. This is a business decision." That answer seemed to bother her more than if I'd admitted it was revenge. Because revenge is emotional. Emotion can be dismissed. But business? Business is cold. She looked at me one more time, then quietly said, "Carl's spot." I nodded. "Carl gets his original spot back." I reviewed the historical assignments. His reassignment wasn't documented and didn't follow the lease terms. So his original space has been restored. Sandra didn't argue. She just turned around slowly and walked back toward her unit without another word. A week later, Brittany submitted an application for a reserved parking space under the new agreement. She was assigned spot 31, the one near the dumpster, the same spot Carl had been pushed into. She drives a white Infiniti Q50. There's still a small dent on the rear bumper. Last I checked, it's still there. And honestly, when all of this was over, what I felt wasn't triumph. It wasn't even revenge in the dramatic way people imagine these stories ending. It was something quieter than that. It felt like balance had been restored. Carl got his parking spot back. The rules became documented and transparent. And suddenly, everyone in the complex had to follow the exact same standards, including Sandra Kellner. In the 14 months since I bought that lot, Sandra has had to contact me anytime she wanted authorization for a tow. Do you know how many times she actually requested one? 0. Funny how quickly people stop abusing authority once accountability enters the room. I stayed at Maplewood Commons for another 6 months after buying the parking lot. Then I found my next investment property and moved on. But I still own that lot to this day. It's one of the cleanest cash-flowing assets in my portfolio. The complex signed a 5-year lease under the updated agreement, and every single month I receive payment for 62 parking spaces. All because one woman believed the rules applied to everyone except her own family. My father would have laughed pretty hard about that. And if I'm being honest, he probably would have called it justice. So now I want to ask you something. Have you ever dealt with someone who had just enough authority to make your life miserable and used every ounce of it? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you of somebody who finally found a permanent solution to a loud problem, send this to them. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't an argument. Sometimes it's a signed deed of sale. I'll see you in the next story. She spent 9 years deciding who deserved a parking space. I spent one morning deciding I'd own all of them.